King Crimson is one of the most important bands in the history of music. Founded in 1968, the band has since seen many different lineups, played very different styles of music, and changed music overall in several ways. In our first video about the band, we covered the period from its beginning in 1968 through 1974. We looked at King Crimson's groundbreaking debut album, In the Court of the Crimson King, which can be regarded as the big bang of prog rock. We discussed the 2 years of searching that followed, encompassed by ever-changing lineups, and examined the amazing 1972 to 1974 band. At its core, guitarist Robert Fripp, violinist David Cross, bassist and vocalist John Wetton, and drummer Bill Bruford. This latter band has been called the third incarnation of King Crimson, and it produced 3 studio albums of stunning impact and originality: Lark's Tongues in Aspic, Starless and Bible Black, and, of course, Red. Like King Crimson Mark I, King Crimson Mark III had a major impact on rock music of the 70s and, of course, beyond. Robert Fripp has been and remains the only continuous member of King Crimson throughout all the many incarnations of the band. One could call him the band leader, but he rejects the label. Fripp has often described King Crimson as an entity or energy that exists outside of the band members, a particular state of mind. Fripp sees himself as the guardian of the King Crimson entity. Since the band's debut album, Fripp has taken most major band decisions, repeatedly dissolving and reforming King Crimson, and determining who the other band members are. As we saw in the previous video, at the end of 1974, Fripp called the band's first major hiatus. It was around the time of the release of Red, widely regarded as the band's magnum opus. Fripp told the press, "King Crimson is completely over, forever and ever."
I left King Crimson for a number of reasons. And one way of putting that forward would be to say that it was no longer an appropriate form of education, that all the questions which were beginning to arise in that Fripp were not meeting a response in the rock and roll world.
He spent a prolonged period of time studying and practicing the teachings of the Armenian philosopher, spiritual teacher and mystic George Ivanovich Gurdjieff, and his English follower J.D. Bennett. However, when Peter Gabriel called Fripp in the autumn of 1976, inviting him to sessions at the Soundstage in Toronto for the singer's debut solo album, the guitarist found that he could not say no. Fripp also agreed to perform live with Gabriel. A year later, Fripp received a call from Brian Eno, who immediately put David Bowie on the phone. The two invited Fripp to Hansa Studios in Berlin, and again he could not refuse. The sessions resulted in Bowie's legendary album Heroes, and Fripp's solos on the title track had become iconic.
I enjoyed it. He gave me freedom. He gave me the structural freedom to do what I can do. Within King Crimson, my role is not really directed towards guitar playing. It's really directed towards other elements, organization, and so on. But purely as a guitar player, Bowie gave me the structural freedom to be the guitar player, which I can be from time to time. Wonderful fun. The first album we did in Berlin, under the shadow of the Berlin Wall, with a machine gun turret aimed into the control room. They could have sprayed us at any time. That was the first time. That was lots of fun.
From nothing will drive them away.
Later that year, and in the beginning of 1978, Fripp played guitar on and produced Gabriel's second album. By this point, Fripp was back in action as a musician, and he worked as a producer and/or guitarist with Blondie, Talking Heads, The Roaches, and Daryl Hall. He worked again with Bowie on Scary Monsters and Gabriel's third album. When working as a producer, he insisted on a similar in-your-face sound, with very little or no reverb, as can be found on the studio albums of King Crimson Mark III. By 1978, Fripp was also active as a solo artist. He started doing solo performances of what he called a small, independent, mobile, and intelligent unit. He used what he called Frippatronics, a 2-tape recorder setup that created long delays, resulting in slow ambient music. Fripp released his first solo album, Exposure, in 1979. It featured some of the artists he had worked with, including Peter Gabriel, Daryl Hall, Peter Hamill, and Brian Eno. It was followed by God Save the Queen, Under Heavy Manners in 1980, which featured Talking Heads singer David Byrne and fast guitar cross-picking on the track The Zero of the Signified. It was a precursor of things to come. In that same year, Fripp founded the League of Gentlemen, which was influenced by New Wave. Over straightforward rhythms and catchy synth lines, Fripp played angular and often atonal guitar parts, usually with a clean tone and, again, making use of his fast cross-picking technique. He called the quartet a second division touring new wave instrumental dance band, and it recorded one self-titled album with strange song titles like Hep Ta Para Pas Chinook and Pareto Optimum, and I'm probably completely pronouncing that wrong, but they were strange. Calling the League of Gentlemen Second Division may sound like a put-down, but the qualification was, in fact, part of the classification system Fripp had devised to try to objectively categorize different levels at which musicians can work.
The first division is popular mass culture, colossal success, the police, things like that. Second division is where one works professionally and honorably and earns a living. And the third division is arts and craft.
According to Fripp, his Frippatronics adventures were in the third division category. By late 1980, Fripp decided he wanted to play in the first division again. He enlisted 3 musicians who were musical heavyweight and first division level: drummer Bill Bruford, bassist Tony Levin, and guitarist and singer Adrian Belew. He called the new band Discipline. Bruford had played in the third incarnation of King Crimson and was one of Britain's foremost drummers. Belew had worked with Frank Zappa, David Bowie, and the Talking Heads, and was the master of the stunt guitar. Levin was well known as one of America's foremost session players and had performed on albums that Fripp had produced for Peter Gabriel and the Roaches. The new quartet wrote and rehearsed for most of March and April in 1981. Fripp, normally extreme in his self-criticism, enthused in his diary that the band was sounding like rock gamelan and called the music amazing, adding, "The failures are equally amazing." In a diary entry of April the 5th, Fripp already floated the idea of calling the band King Crimson, writing, "I recognise its features well." But the band's first live performances in April and May of 1981 in the UK, France, Amsterdam and Belgium still took place under the name Discipline. Audiences witnessed a virtuoso band with ferocious energy and a completely new sound. A lot of the material was based around Fripp's extremely fast arpeggios, cross-picked with a clean tone, a technique that he had already used with Talking Heads on the track I Zimbra, on his second solo album, and with the League of Gentlemen. With Belew as a fellow guitar player and Levin often playing the Chapman stick, Fripp's rapid-fire guitar ostinatos resulted in the band's signature sound of complex, interlocking guitar parts, usually played with clean guitar tones. The repetitive circular rhythmic patterns had echoes of Indonesian gamelan music, as well as minimalism and pointillism and African music. Much of the band's music also had a very up-to-date 80s sound. Belew and Fripp both played Roland GR300 guitar synths, with Fripp using a Roland Saturn 09 synth and Roland G303 guitar synth controller. Bruford also added electronic Simmons SDSV drums to his arsenal. The more traditional instruments the musicians played around this time included a Les Paul guitar, with John Alvey tuner strings played by Fripp. Belew often performed on a Fender Stratocaster and an Ibanez Blazer, both with Dean Markley strings, 10 to 38. Effects pedals included the Foxtone Machine, Electro-Harmonix Big Muff, Crybaby Wah and Boss SP1, DS1 and CE1, while Belew's pedals included Electro-Harmonix Graphic Fuzz, Big Muff, Polychorus, MXR Graphic EQ, and Roland DC30 Analog Chorus Echo. Levin used a Yamaha SB100 professional systems board with EQ, fuzz, delay, octave divider, and preamp units. Fripp, Ballou, and Levin all used Roland JC120 amps, in Levin's case for the upper range of his Chapman stick. Levin also used an Ampeg SVT for the low end, and Fripp and Ballou had Music Man 212 HO amps for their straight guitar sounds. The quartet's spectacular live performance received a mixed reception from British critics. One claimed that the band played emotionless, arrogant, clever music, a lack of personality in inverse ratio to the talents combined on stage. It was a shock and a shame that such musicians could join in an exercise of egghead wanking. However, audiences were enthusiastic, which helped land the band a record deal. By the time it approached record companies, the band had taken the decision to take on the King Crimson name, which also made it a more commercially attractive proposition. During May and June of 1981, the band recorded its debut album at Island Studios in London, with Rhett Davies engineering and producing. The resulting album, Discipline, was released in September of 1981. Critical reactions at the time again were mixed, with one critic calling it incredibly dull and pointless, like a film that sacrifices plot and characterization for flashy special effects and stunts. However, by contrast, other critics called it undeniably great, a vast tornado of energy, eye-opening, even shocking, and postmodern rock with ethno-trance tribalism. Over time, Discipline has grown to be universally regarded as a timeless and hugely influential masterpiece. The interlocking guitar and Chapman stick patterns feature complex meters and polyrhythms, ostinatos, and the aforementioned gamelan and world music influences. There are also many striking and unusual sounds, from industrial clangs, clashes, and sirens to Ballou's imitating shrieking elephants in Elephant Talk. There is rarely any harmonic development in the traditional sense, because the music tends to spend a certain amount of time on one chord and then simply moves to another chord and rests there for a while before moving again. The repetitive and circular multi-rhythms of frame by frame can be traced back to both African music and the minimalistic music of composer Steve Reich. The musicians would not only often play polyrhythms, but each musician would sometimes also play in a different time signature. For example, by one musician removing a note from a particular pattern, resulting in what has been called phasing, two instruments moving in and out of sync with each other. In an interview on Dutch TV in 2011, Adrian Ballou explained how it was done.
Show. It's a simple building block that Robert and I used in so much of the material for the earliest version of the band, the 80s band, where one guy plays one figure, the other guy plays the other figure, but slightly different. And you want me to play
Yes.
it? Yeah, sure, I can do that. I'll demonstrate exactly
Because
what
it's
I'm
really
showing
a signature of King Crimson.
Yes, okay. Let me go right here and I'll do that real quick. Now, what I'm going to do is I'm going to play my figure and I'm going to make a loop of it so I can play the other figure.
Okay.
So this is a song called Frame by Frame. So it starts with this little figure in 7. Close enough. I can demonstrate it with that. Now, that's the figure that I would play. Robert would play that same figure for a moment, but then he would drop one of the notes out, and it changes everything.
Okay.
And it makes it create a different kind of sound. Here you go. I'll join my part as though I'm Robert. And as you see, they eventually come back together. It's mathematics.
The modern musical influences on Discipline include progressive rock, art rock, new wave, post-punk, industrial rock, and math rock, while other classical influences include The Rite of Spring by Stravinsky, Musique Concrete, George Antheil's Industrial Pieces, and John Cage's mindset of going beyond any kind of accepted musical form. Discipline remains a remarkable achievement to this day, one of the most influential albums of all time. It signified a remarkable achievement in that King Crimson had created 3 classic albums in 3 separate decades. In the Court of the Crimson King in 1969, Red in 1974, and Discipline in 1981. Similar to the 2 previous incarnations of the band, the 4th incarnation of King Crimson produced 3 studio albums and lasted for around 3 years. The band's second album was recorded in March and April of 1982 at Odyssey Studios in London, again with Rhett Davies at the controls. Drummer Bill Bruford has commented that the band did not find it easy to come up with a relevant follow-up to Discipline. We weren't sure how much to continue with the heterophonic weaving of the guitars. The thing that had started the band had already seemed to become a millstone around its neck. Perhaps to fill the gap of uncertainty, Ballou contributed several completed songs to the sessions, which ran counter to the established working methods of writing tracks collectively. The sessions were also notable for a conflict between Ballou and Fripp, with Ballou asking Fripp to leave the studio at one point. Fripp ended up not being involved in the mix process. He later commented that the band had already drifted from its original vision, while Ballou said it was the most awful record-making experience of my life. Beat was released in June of 1982, and while it was stylistically a different extension of its predecessor with more pop influences and lyrics inspired by the Beat generation and writer Jack Kerouac, it is, by some, regarded as less consistent. The album nevertheless contains many highlights, including Neil and Jack and Me, Heartbeat and Requiem. Bruford has commented that the music worked well in a live environment, and earmarks Neil, Jack and Me and Waiting Man as favourites. It all came together on Waiting Man, all that heterophonic interweaving, all that talk of village music and gamelands. My electronic drums were pitched up to play notes in the airy, marimba-like rhythmic tapestry. 3 minutes when we escaped the tyranny of the backbeat. Living, meanwhile, has said that Neurotica, with its almost out-of-control frenzy, totally unique lyrics, and tight concept as a band, was the best effort. It also turned out to be a lot of fun to play live. King Crimson Mark IV's third album was recorded over the course of 1983 at Arnie's Shack, Marcus Studios and Bearsville Sound Studio in Woodstock, New York. The sessions were produced by the band, with Tony Arnold and Brad Davies engineering. The resulting album, 3 of a Perfect Pair, was released in March of 1984 and is also regarded as uneven but with amazing highlights. Such descriptions particularly shine through with the title track and the single Sleepless, which features a monster bass riff by Levin. Side 2 is more experimental and closes with Lark's Tongues in Aspic Part 3. Both the title and the music refer to the first album by the third, 1972 to 1974 incarnation of King Crimson. The closing track's title in 3 of a Perfect Pair suggests a bookend and foreshadows the end of King Crimson Mark IV. After the tour ended, Fripp called it a day, almost exactly a decade after he did the same thing with a third incarnation of the band. In an almost exact repeat of what had been said 10 years previously, he remarked, "I feel I've created a field in which other people can discover themselves. I'm disappointed they don't create a room for me to discover myself. That is the dynamic of what happens. I get squeezed out." He poignantly added, "All my best guitar work is done outside of King Crimson." Regardless of Fripp's personal feelings at the time, the legacy of King Crimson Mark IV as one of the most original bands of the 80s remains alive today. One reviewer called the 3 albums Promethean feats in a dreary time. The albums are credited as a foundational influence on the math and industrial rock genres, and arguably they were the only albums that moved the progressive rock genre forward during the 80s, in contrast to many other established prog rock bands that were retracing their steps from the 60s and 70s, or had even shifted genres completely. After disbanding Crimson Mark IV, it was a logical next step for Fripp to again explore collaborations with others. He had already recorded an album with the Police guitarist Andy Summers, I Advance Mast. In 1984, he worked with him on Bewitched. At the end of 1984, Fripp once again, as he put it, left public life as a musician. This time, his focus was on teaching guitar through a series of classes called Guitar Craft, incorporating some of the spiritual teachings of Gurdjieff and Bennett. Fripp presented a new approach to playing the flat pick acoustic guitar. He also introduced a new tuning, C, G, D, A, E, G, which he called the New Standard Tuning, which he used from this point onwards. Guitarcraft saw the blossoming of Fripp as a philosopher of music, who liked to condense his ideas in often witty and thought-provoking aphorisms. For example, a mistake is always forgivable, rarely excusable, and never acceptable. A better mistake is to play the wrong note with enthusiasm than the right note with temerity and fear. And a comfortable life and a creative life are mutually exclusive. Another example is a statement Fripp made in an interview in 1984. Most people assume that a musician creates music, but I don't look at it that way at all. I say music creates the musician. In time, one develops a relationship with the music where it's not what one requires of the music, but what the music requires of the musician. And it's only at this point that anything worthwhile happens, where you recognize that music not only has a life of its own, but that the life the music has is more real than life itself. Or have a listen to this snippet of an interview with Fripp from 1979.
Art is where you wish to go. Craft is how you get there. The art, a number of different ways of approaching this. I mean, art is a leveled experience, which works on a number of different levels simultaneously. It's in a sense a mirror of an individual person or society or whatever. A commercial situation is something which exists only on one level. But my concern is always to touch that intangible something, which is it's the difference between really making love and wanking. That it's an entirely different quality experience.
During the late 80s, Fripp was active as a performing musician in a band with his wife, Toyah Willcox, called Sunday All Over the World. In the early 90s, he collaborated extensively with singer David Sylvian. Fripp and Sylvian released 3 joint projects: a studio album, The First Day, a remix album, Dashan, The Road to Graceland, and a live album, Damage Live. In 1992, Fripp set up his own label, Discipline Global Mobile, together with producer David Singleton. Meanwhile, reforming King Crimson had been on Fripp's mind since 1990. He had asked David Sylvian to become the singer, but Sylvian declined and suggested their collaboration. In 1991, Adrian Belew contacted Fripp, suggesting they restart Crimson, and in 1992, the idea came to Fripp of the band as a double trio. In other words, 2 times drums, bass, and guitar. 2 years later, Fripp judged that conditions for King Crimson to reform were finally right. Building on the considerable achievements of the Sylvian-Fripp project, he invited 2 musicians who had been part of the project, drummer Pat Mastelotto and Chapman stick and wah guitar player Trey Gunn, who had also been a guitar craft student. Adrian Belew and Tony Levin were immediately interested in being part of a 5th incarnation of Crimson, and once Bill Bruford was in the position to join, the double trio lineup was complete. King Crimson Mark V therefore turned out to be King Crimson Mark IV with the addition of Mastelotto and Gunn. The new lineup met up for the first time on April the 18th, 1994, and wrote and recorded its debut album, Vroom, in Applehead, a boutique studio in Woodstock, New York. Fripp explained that Vroom meant an inevitable and remorseless forward movement which carries everything before it. The large degree in which the 5th incarnation of King Crimson built on the Sylvian Fripp project was further illustrated by the fact that David Bortrell was invited to engineer, mix, and co-produce the EP. He had fulfilled the same functions with Sylvian Fripp. Bortrell mixed Vroom at Peter Gabriel's Real World Studios. Here's David Bortrell on the Joel Martin Mastery podcast talking about the recordings of Vroom.
Obviously, Tony Levin I had worked with before, and even Trey Gunn I had worked with because we did that David Sylvian Robert Fripp project the first day. So I had worked with a couple of them already, including Robert. I found, it was sort of natural progression from that. Working with these guys was really exciting. It was such a funny introduction to Bill Bruford, because we set up in a studio in Woodstock, New York, and it was this small studio that we were kind of using more than the studio was really capable of. And so we kind of got in extra tape machines and extra consoles in order to do this, because the way they were setting up was as a dual trio. It was 2 drummers, 2 bass instrument players, stick and bass, and 2 guitar players. So I had to have enough inputs for 2 full drum kits. And the drum kits that they had weren't small drum kits, so they were always quite big. But we were recording the first version. We kind of got set up, and this is the first time I had recorded them. And we ran through a version of Thrack, right? And so we got it all, we played it down one time. It's the first time I've heard this song. And I don't know if you know the song, it's quite involved. There's sort of a thematic thing at the beginning, an improv section in the middle, and then the theme at the end. Again, this is the first time I've ever heard this thing. So they come back in after the performance, and this is like a 7-8 minute piece of music, and we play through it. So this playthrough is the second time I've heard this song. So we finished the record, finished the thing, and Bruford turns to me. He goes, "Oh, okay, great. But I kind of messed up here at the end theme here. Can from bar, I don't remember the number, X to bar Y, can you drop me in and drop me out of this?" Now, this is a drop in on analog tape of drums, in and out, which is an extraordinarily difficult thing to do and get right in a piece that's, let's put it this way, 3 different musicians are playing in 3 different time signatures. So trying to count what is one on any given bar. Anyway, in the process of this, I turn around and Trey and Tony are just howling with laughter because they know this is the second time I've heard this intricate piece of music, and Bill's asking me to drop him out in very specific places. Anyway, I said, "Yes, Bill, I can, but I'm going to have to learn this to count it. So, let me play me through, show me where. And he did, and we did it. And I managed to get it in and out. I was pretty good at punching, but it was just, I got to count. You got to learn to count. What are you in? I'm in 15. Okay. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. In. 1, 2, 3, out. And he was happy with it.
Having signed a record deal with Virgin Records, King Crimson Mark V recorded his first full studio album at Real World Studios in the fall of 1994, again with Bill Bortrell engineering, mixing, and co-producing. Thrack was released on April the 3rd, 1994. Several pieces on the album are developments of tracks that appeared on Vroom. The music is, in many ways, a fusion of the music from the 1972 and 74 and the 1981 to 84 bands. Just like in the 70s, there are heavy, menacing atonal tracks in the style of Lark's Tongues in Aspic Part 2 and Red. Examples are the title track, Thrack, Vroom, and Vroom Vroom. The 80s influence is obvious in the multi-rhythmic interlocking guitar patterns. Bortrell, with panning in the mix, placed the 2 trios in various different positions, starting the album with all musicians in the center. The track Vroom Vroom also incorporates a middle section originally composed by Fripp in 1974 for Red's instrumental title track. The music on Thrack is a further development of an earlier King Crimson music in the way that some of the tracks are arranged. For example, the heavy rock of Dinosaur and Sex, Sleep, Eat, Drink, Dream. The funk of People and the gorgeous and delicate arrangements of the 2 ballads, Walking on Air and One Time, which both have echoes of the Beatles. There are also a number of short instrumental interludes called In a Garden and Radio, and a track that combines abstract industrial sounds with drum solos. Ba-boom. Other new developments include the influences of grunge and industrial rock.
There is no nostalgia whatsoever involved in King Crimson. My own response to King Crimson is one of quiet terror.
You never get another King Crimson album. You get a completely different one. I mean, there's very little relationship between the album Discipline of 1980, for example, to Thrack of 1995, to In the Court of the Crimson King of 1969. King Crimson changes its repertoire and its personnel and its instrumentation and its modus operandi completely pretty much every time it's taken down off the shelf. That's what's great about it. It is a holding name. It's an umbrella name. Look out for the music. You don't know what you're going to get. We certainly do.
Reviewers have called the music high-quality prog and erratic, off-the-wall, bizarre, incredibly complicated. One reviewer wrote that King Crimson was the only progressive rock band from the 60s to be making new, vital, progressive music in the 90s. The double trio lineup toured extensively during 1995 and 1996, but ran into trouble in 1997 when the band tried to write new music. Friction between various band members led to Bill Bruford leaving King Crimson. With no clear way ahead for King Crimson, the decision was taken to break up in smaller groups called projects to make it easier to improvise and work on new material and incorporate different styles of music, including jazz, industrial, techno, and drum and bass. Fripp called the process Fractalization, as both of those are with Ks. During 1997 to 1999, 4 different project lineups were in action, producing 1 studio album and a multitude of live recordings. In 1999, Levin left the projects due to other touring and session commitments. In that year, the 6th incarnation of King Crimson came into being. It consisted of Fripp, Ballou, Trey Gunn, and Pat Mastelotto. The lineup has also been called a double duo, and it recorded the album The Construction of Light in Nashville. Most of the recordings were done by Ken Latchney at Ballou's basement home studio, using 4 Elise's ADATs and edited in Pro Tools. Latchney and Bill Munyon mixed the album at 17 grand recording. The Construction of Light was released in May of 2000. The album, which incorporated industrial influences to a larger extent than ever before, received mixed reactions, with some calling it a backward-looking album. Fripp also was strongly dissatisfied, calling the sum of the parts greater than the whole. In 2019, the album was re-released as The Reconstruction of Light. It had been reworked with new drum overdubs by drummer Pat Mastelotto and with new mixes by Don Gunn, with help from Mastelotto, Fripp, and David Singleton. King Crimson released its 13th and to date final studio album, The Power to Believe. It featured the same March 6 lineup as its predecessor of Fripp, Ballou, Gunn, and Mastelotto. Similar to what happened with Vroom and Thrack, The Power to Believe contains a lot of music that is a development of an EP that was released earlier. In this case, happy with what you have to be happy with. The music on The Power to Believe is the outcome of 2 years of touring by the double duo, including 9 concerts in 2001 when they shared the bill with Tool, themselves huge fans of King Crimson. This inspired King Crimson March 6 to play heavier material. The Power to Believe was recorded in the Tracking Room and Studio Ballou, both in Nashville, Pat's Garage in Austin, Texas, and St. Peter's Church in New Lynn, Cornwall, England. Having realized that their normal self-produced DIY approach had led to a disappointing outcome in The Construction of Light, the band enlisted Gene Freeman, aka Machine, to engineer, mix, and produce the new album. Freeman had worked with industrial rock band Pitch Shifter and new metal and rap metal band Head PE. The Power to Believe was released on March 4th, 2003, and by all accounts, the band was happy with the result. One reviewer called the album simply stunning, and another a revelation for a few young metalheads. The album includes several updates of the pounding, multimeter, and multi-tonal bulldozer riffing that was pioneered with Red. This is most strongly the case in a track like Level 5. The album also contains funk crunch of Electric, which incorporates clean guitar cross-picking and gentler tracks like Eyes Wide Open, and The Power to Believe 2, as echoes of Lark's Tongues in Aspic Part 1. Another common thread on the album is that Baloo's vocals are often processed through a vocoder. To all extents and purposes, The Power to Believe is a worthy conclusion to King Crimson's studio output, if it so turns out. The 6th incarnation of King Crimson toured in 2003, but by the end of the tour, Trey Gunn had left and was replaced by Tony Levin. In 2004, King Crimson went on a hiatus again, reforming in 2008 for a series of live concerts with Fripp, Baloo, Levin, Mastalotto, and lastly Gavin Harrison as a second drummer, who had played with Porcupine Tree. In 2010, Fripp began working with guitarist, singer, and producer Jarko Yarczyk. Joined by saxophonist and flautist Mel Collins, who had played with Crimson in the 70s, and accompanied by Levin and Gavin Harrison, they recorded an excellent and lyrical sounding studio album called A Scarcity of Miracles, which was billed as a King Crimson project. The quintet provided the foundation for the 7th incarnation of King Crimson. Fripp had the idea of a band with 3 drummers and invited Bill Rieflin as the 3rd drummer. Rieflin had, like Trey Gunn, been a guitar craft student. The group was nicknamed the Seven-Headed Beast and performed with 3 drummers, Harrison, Mastalotto, and Rieflin at the front of the stage, and Fripp, Baloo, Yarczyk, and Collins behind them.
Robert Fripp is very much that way. I mentioned he started the band with this incarnation with 3 drummers, and all he said to the drummers was reinvent rock drumming. That's what he said to them. He didn't say, okay, I want you to do this, and I have this idea. He said, you 3 guys, that's it. And Tony will play along with you. He'll work it out. And he had carefully chosen the guys to implement his vision with vision of their own.
In 2015, Rieflin was replaced by drummer Jeremy Stacey, who had played with both Robbie Williams and Eric Clapton. Stacey has remained in the band ever since. When Rieflin returned for a short period in 2017, King Crimson briefly became an octet. The 7th lineup of King Crimson, aka the Seven-Headed Beast, with drummers Gavin Harrison, Mastalotto, and Jeremy Stacey, and Fripp on guitar and keyboards, Yarczyk on guitars and vocals, Levin on bass and Chapman stick, and Mel Collins on various wind instruments, has remained in place until its last performance on 2021. It is unclear whether there will be any more performances by the band. During the 21st century, the focus of King Crimson has almost entirely been on live performance, the band's last 2 studio albums aside. Over the last 2 decades, Fripp and Singleton's label, DGM, has released a seemingly limitless flow of live albums and box sets. This includes at least 8 live albums by the 7th incarnation of King Crimson alone. In addition, the box sets are dazzlingly extensive. For example, Starless, released in 2014 with studio and live music from the 1972 and 74 band, contains 23 CDs, 2 Blu-ray audio discs, and 2 DVDs, adding up to a grand total of 400 tracks. The box set Heaven and Earth, live and in the studio 1997 to 2008, was released in 2019 and contains 18 CDs, 4 Blu-ray discs, and 2 DVDs, with a total track count of almost 1,200. Is it possible to overdose on King Crimson? It's clearly possible to try. However, what is beyond any doubt is that King Crimson has, over the course of its 13 studio albums, incorporated and developed numerous genres and pushed the boundaries of music in many different ways. It would be difficult to name a serious musician who has not, in some way, been influenced by the band. Robert Fripp has been called the godfather of prog rock. But in fact, both King Crimson and he have gone far beyond prog rock and influenced musicians of far beyond said genre. In fact, Fripp's career has been so multifaceted and taken and inspired so many musical twists and turns that he can be compared to the ever-changing jazz and jazz rock legend, Miles Davis. In the 54 years since its inception, King Crimson has taken many detours and roads less traveled. Active over a stunning 7 decades, the band has consistently been a force of nature, torn through the fabric of music and lifted the veil on many unknown places. In doing so, the band has introduced us all to countless new and exciting musical vistas. I don't know what else to say. I've seen the band live with 3 different lineups, and every single lineup has been amazing. I didn't get to see them until the 80s, so I saw Levin and Bruford and Adrian Belew and Fripp in that incredible lineup. I had bought those 3 incredible albums, which I personally like. Discipline's a masterpiece, of course, with Elephant Talk, you know, that incredible bass playing and then the screaming elephant. Amazing. Levin and everybody on that is incredible. But for me, Three of a Perfect Pair is one of my favorite records ever. I don't know why. I know it's considered to be maybe not the best of the 3. I don't know if that's true or not. But there is some insanity. Fretless guitar on that. Fretless guitar. And the way that they pull like this insane kind of musical chaos and then come into pop choruses. Like, I'm ready to go, I'm fighting my way out of here. And it's just like a pop chorus. And then it goes do-do-do-do-do, and just goes into this insanity again. It's what I want from music. What I always talk about and will continue to talk about is everything. I want a great song. I would love to hear amazing production. And it would be amazing to hear great performances and musicianship as well. And that is King Crimson. That is King Crimson in the most wrapped up way. It's why I love bands like Queen, why I think that Bohemian Rhapsody is the greatest song ever written and produced, because it has all those same things. It keeps me interested from start to finish. King Crimson records, King Crimson live keep me interested from start to finish. And they also write incredible melodies that are hooky and that you can sing along with. It's not just all about technique. It's not just all about great production. It's about the whole package. So if you're not already a fan of King Crimson, which I'm sure you are if you've got to the end of this video, but if you are one of the few people that watch to the end that's not a fan, go check them out. Everything I now, as far as I know, is now available on Spotify. I haven't checked on Tidal, but I'm sure it is. If not, who cares? Go out and buy it. Buy some of these box sets. I mean, you will not be disappointed. When the newest version, when the 7-headed beast goes back and does old versions of the songs, they reinvigorate them. The band is phenomenal. They breathe new life into some of the greatest music ever recorded in the 60s and 70s. So you will never be disappointed. So if it just means going and buying the new stuff and the box sets or streaming it or whatever you want to do, just do it. As you can tell, I'm a huge fan. Thanks ever so much for watching. I really appreciate it. If you got this far, you're a rock star. Please leave any comments and questions below, any other suggestions of artists and bands you want us to talk about. I'm sure we're going to do a video just on Fripp alone. We've covered as much as we can. We've obviously done the interview with Tony Levin. If you haven't checked that out, please check out the interview with Tony down below. Thanks ever so much for watching. I really appreciate it. So long, everybody. So long. Farewell. Auf Wiedersehen. Au revoir. Adios. Adio. Ciao. Tschüss. Goodbye.